I've chosen as the title of this talk, Denys Reitz, Primus inter pares, in English, First Among Equals, but I prefer the Latin. In his poem, Little Gidding, T.S. Eliot said the following: "What we call the beginning is often the end, and to make an end is to make a beginning. The end is where we start from." So let me start at the end of the last book written by Denys Reitz, which is also the end of Adrift on the Open Veld, the trilogy of Denys Reitz's 3 books, Commando, Trekking On and No Outspan. The end is as follows, and I quote: "And now, with Russia grinding up the flower of Hitler's brave young Nazi soldiers, with America and Australia holding Japan in the Far East, and with American and British troops landing in North Africa, I come to a close. I realize that in comparison with the mighty events shaking the world, my narrative has small significance. But I wrote this book because I like setting down things seen and experienced, and also because I wish to prove that in spite of our racial and political squabbles, South Africa is a country of goodwill and good temper, and has the hope and prospect of unity into a single nation in years to come." End of quote. These are typically modest yet prophetic words from the man I choose to call primus inter pares, first among equals. Some years ago, and quite by chance, my eldest son, Stephen, happened to meet a young man by the name of Alex Emslie, and they were amazed to find that they shared the same surname. Stephen's surname, like mine, is spelled E-M-S-L-I-E, whereas Alex's surname, like his father's, Paul's, is spelled E-M-S-L-E-Y. Somehow, way back in the mists of time, and indeed way back in the mists of Scotland, the surnames were probably the same, but at some point they diverged, probably to prove some obscure clannish point. Alex Emslie, himself a Cape Town artist, is the son of the famous artist Paul Emslie, previously of Stellenbosch University, and now based in England, who painted the famous portraits of the Princess of Wales, Nelson Mandela, and William Kentridge, amongst others. Alex's uncle, Professor Robin Emslie, was for many years a professor of psychiatry at Stellenbosch University. I know this because at one stage I regularly received weekend telephone calls intended for him, not me. Anyway, all of that is irrelevant. I mention it merely because I wish to quote what Alex Emslie said to my son Stephen, a total stranger but for the bond of having the same surname, in a WhatsApp message shortly after they had met for the first time. They discussed the book Adrift on the Open Veld in the course of establishing the provenance of their surnames, and in a subsequent message, Alex said what I have, with permission, taken the liberty of quoting in my editorial note to Adrift on the Open Veld. What he said was this, and I quote: "Adrift on the Open Veld is the best book I've ever read. No bullshit. The whole world should read it." End of quote. This is a fine, if somewhat earthy, assessment of the literary skill of the man I choose to call, somewhat less earthily, primus inter pares. But my use of these words is not without an element of irony. For Denys Reitz was no Paul Kruger, and by the way, this past 10th of October was the 200th birthday of Paul Kruger. No Louis Botha, no Koos de la Rey, no Christian de Wet, no Herzog, no Jan Smuts, and no Winston Churchill, all of whom were known to him personally. But he was his own man, an adventurous free spirit who, despite living close to the center of things, was fiercely independent, understood his adversaries without despising them, as in his reference to Hitler's brave young Nazi soldiers. He could distinguish between the soldiers and the head of the nation. And he had a rare gift of insight into both people and events. This made him an outstanding politician, despite paraphrasing what he wrote in No Outspan, his third book, and I quote, "Dreaming of a far-off country and seeing elephant-like goods trains passing over the hills, while members droned and debates dragged on in Parliament," unquote. His interests extended far beyond the world of politics, and reading between the lines, he was able to reach what turned out to be correct conclusions based on spoken or unspoken understandings derived from political opponents who were nevertheless friends. Thus, Denys may not have been primus inter pares in the sense of leading a country or commanding an army, although he came very close to both of those things. He was Deputy Prime Minister of South Africa during the Second World War, and we know that Smuts was away for a lot of the time. And he commanded a Scottish battalion at the end of the First World War. But in a different way, he was, and to me remains, first among equals. He had incredible insight into people and events from an early age. He was able to observe and recall events with amazing accuracy, and he formed judgments that, in my opinion, have stood the test of time. Above all, he was widely read, had a deep understanding of literature, and was a wonderfully articulate writer and speaker. People loved Denys Reitz. Thomas Pakenham, author of the book entitled The Boer War, said the following: "Reitz had the uncanny knack of living through the war as though leafing through the pages of an adventure story." This speaks volumes not only about Denys's bravery and survival skills during the Boer War, but also about his skill as a writer. He was, after all, the author of the adventure story through which we are privileged to be able to leaf. The calm intensity and absorbing human interest of his writing are both immediate and timeless, enable readers to feel as if they were there, even 125 years later. In this respect, Denys Reitz is, in my opinion, without equal. You don't read Paul Kruger or Louis Botha or Koos de la Rey or Christian de Wet, who did write a book entitled The 3 Years' War, or Herzog or Jan Smuts or Winston Churchill on the Boer War. You read Denys Reitz, whose book Commando has sold more copies than all other books on the Boer War combined. In the very first chapter of Commando, Denys describes a family visit to Scotland while his father was still president of the Orange Free State Republic. And he writes as follows, and I quote, that's why I've got such extensive notes, because I'm quoting all the time. "My father had studied law in Scotland, and my grandfather before him had studied agriculture. They both had a deep love of Scotland and Scotch literature, and at our home scarcely a night passed without a reading from Burns or Scott, so that we felt as if we were among our own people." End of quote. Thus, the literary instincts of the young Denys Reitz were nurtured at home in Bloemfontein. This had a counterpart in the following episode in the Magaliesberg during the Boer War, and again I quote, "On my way down the gorge, I found 2 wounded officers beside the track, one with his thumb shot away and the other with a broken arm. As I came up, I heard one of them remark, 'Here comes a typical young Boer for you.' And they asked me whether I understood English. I told them yes, and the man with the thumb said, 'Then will you tell me why you fellows are continuing the war, because you're bound to lose?' I replied, 'Oh well, you see, we're like Mr. Makoba. We're waiting for something to turn up.' They burst out laughing, and the one said, 'Didn't I tell you this is a funny country? And now here's your typical young Boer quoting Dickens.' As already already mentioned, Denys Reitz wrote 3 wonderful books, Commando, Trekking On, and No Outspan, published as a trilogy under the title Adrift on the Open Veld, which is now also available under the title Deur die Sterre gelei in Afrikaans. The most well-known of the 3 books in the trilogy is Commando, Denys' account of his experience during the Boer War. He was never captured, and he fought right through the war from its beginning on the 11th of October 1899 to its end on the 31st of May 1902. In itself, a remarkable achievement. But what is truly exceptional about Denys is that not only was he an incredibly fearless, brave and daredevil fighter, and he really was, one who seemed to court danger, yet survived against the odds, but he was also a gifted writer, able to describe his experiences with remarkable eloquence and empathy. And he was able to take in far more than one would expect from a typical 17-year-old school leaver. For Denys was 17 years old when he went on Commando, 4 months after having matriculated at Grey College in Bloemfontein in June 1899. Commando contains the following dedication, and I quote, "This book is dedicated to my father, Francis William Reitz, the only living president of the old South African republics," end of quote. Under this dedication is the following inscription in Latin. Now, I had to get help to find out what this meant, so don't feel bad if you don't get it. Victrix causa diis placuit sed victa cantoni, which translated means, if the victor had the gods on his side, the vanquished had morality on his.
Wow.
Like other civil wars, the Boer War remains a source of emotion for those whose forebears, men and women, fought and suffered during and after this bitter, unequal conflict. A lost cause that continues to enthrall and captivate many South Africans. Insights into the war and the attitudes that provoked and prolonged it facilitate a deeper understanding of South African history for South Africans and visitors to this country alike, illustrating perhaps something of the tenacity of its inhabitants, such as all of us. Denys' other 2 books are equally enthralling. Trekking On is the account of his departure into voluntary exile in Madagascar after the war, the hard times he endured there, his return to South Africa, the 1940 rebellion, the invasion of German West Africa, and thereafter German East Africa, and trench warfare in France during the First World War. The 3rd book, No Outspan, deals with Reitz's return to South Africa after the First World War, determined to stay out of politics, his election soon thereafter as a Member of Parliament, and his appointment as Minister of Forestry and Land. There could have been no better portfolio for this explorer and adventurer. And thereafter, an amazing account of excitement, travel, the establishment of the Kruger National Park and other game reserves, like the Wonterbok Park, which is not from here, far from here, and generally a life of unremitting exploration and curiosity that fully justified the title, No Outspan. Okay, so this is a quote from the book Trekking On. On the morning of the 23rd of October, that's today, a man came into my office and, locking the door behind him, whispered in my ear that David van Koller, the district commandant, was coming with a strong force that night to take the town on General de Wet's behalf, and that I was to be shot in my backyard. Having delivered himself of this at a gulp, he unlocked the door and quickly vanished. I telephoned the information to General Smuts in Pretoria, and I suggested that I should collect volunteers to defend the place. He gave me peremptory orders to do nothing of the kind. He said that if Van Koller came in and we fired on his men, the nationalists would raise a cry throughout the country and would say that we had started the trouble. He said he did not like leaving me in the lurch, but they were expecting outbreaks at other centres, so I was to look after myself. In view of this, I saw no reason why I should tamely remain to be captured by my political opponents. I did not believe that I would be shot, for the Boers are not given to assassination. But in the heat of our long quarrels, I had made many enemies, and the least that would happen to me would be arrest and indignities. I decided, therefore, to make my escape. I was able to ascertain that already, out of sight, there were rebel pickets on every road leading from the town, so a daylight attempt was out of the question, and my only hope was a getaway after dark. In the meanwhile, I pretended to be ignorant of what was afoot, and I attended to my affairs until 4 in the afternoon, when I went home to prepare for flight, and I ordered Reiter to get our horses ready. Reiter had been with me for years. He was a bandy-legged, diminutive Hottentot, the ugliest and loyalist servant a man ever had. My horse was a thoroughbred named Bismarck, one of the best in the country. And by the way, throughout all of these books, Denys Reitz loved horses. And Reiter had a fast Basutu pony. When I explained matters to him, he said we had the legs of any animals in the district. As we were waiting, ready saddled for darkness to fall, 2 young farmers, Daniel Malherbe and Fritz Weilbach, came galloping to my house. They were government men, and they had both taken a prominent stand in the political war, so they had decided that the town was the best place for them. They said that the countryside had risen, that mounted bands were patrolling in every direction, and that it was only by hard riding that they had got through. When I told them of the orders received from General Smuts, they agreed to join my attempt to bolt. By now, standing in my yard, we could see rebel horsemen dotting the skyline, so there was no time to lose. And the moment it was dark enough, we set off, and slinking by the jail and the municipal pound, slipped quietly out of town. We left not a moment too soon, for we found afterwards that within 20 minutes of our passing, every exit was occupied by pickets, which must even then have been closing silently in as we went. Once clear of the streets, we proceeded cautiously, our rifles at the ready, for we expected trouble, but we reached the railway crossing 4 miles away without being challenged. And beyond that, we halted in a hollow in order to take stock. We had no definite plans. Our first impulse had been to escape from the more immediate danger in the town, and now that we had accomplished this, the question arose what we should do next. The whole district, and for all we knew, the whole country was in revolt, and as far as we could tell, wherever we went, we should still be among enemies. So we decided to remain where we were for the night and see what the morrow would bring. Typical Denys Reitz attitude. At dawn, we told Reiter to fetch our horses from the paddock into which they had been turned, and I crawled up the slope with my rifle to see whether the coast was clear. Carefully peering over the edge, I found myself looking down upon about 70 armed men, almost within a stone's throw of me. I took a good look at the party, among whom I recognized some of my best clients. He was an attorney. And then, seeing another outpost on the hill beyond, I wormed my way back to where Malherbe and Weilbach were awaiting me with our horses. Reiter was still running about trying to bring in his pony. By now, more men were riding down from the hill, waving and shouting to those out of sight near the crossing. And as I knew that they would not harm him if he were captured, I told him to hide himself in the grass, since we could not wait for him, and we galloped off, bearing west, the only direction that seemed open to us. The instant we rode out of the little hollow, the men at the railway saw us, and leaping onto their horses, they gave chase. My horse Bismarck could outdistance any animal which the rebel band behind us was likely to have, and both Daniel and Fritz were noted for the quality of the horses they bred. So our chief danger was that we might be brought down by a bullet, or that we might be shepherded into the arms of some other rebel force coming our way. Fortunately, neither of these things happened. We soon drew out of range, and as Van Koller, in his anxiety to make sure of the town, had concentrated most of his men around it during the night, we had the district to ourselves. After a while we heard galloping in our rear, and looking round, saw my boy Reiter riding hard. He had lain low while the rebels were streaming past, but after they had gone, the plucky fellow had caught his pony and cutting cross-country to avoid the hunt, had actually overtaken us. I love this description that follows now. Towards 3 in the afternoon, we approached Wolverhoek Station on the railway line that comes up through the Free State to Johannesburg and Pretoria. We had ridden 25 miles by then, and most of the rebels had dropped out. About a dozen of them, however, better mounted or more determined than the rest, made a final bid to get within range before we reached the cover of the station buildings, and they came hurrying towards us in a cloud of dust. We were not certain whether the station was held by rebels or not, but we were relieved as we rode to see the mail train steaming in from the south. It was the last train to get through before the line was broken up, and passengers leaned from every window to view what must have seemed to them like a cinema performance. 3 armed men and a servant riding for their lives, and something like a sheriff's posse coming on behind. End of quote. They then went and saw Smuts and Botha in Pretoria. Another passage, this time from No Outspan. And in my opinion, this speaks volumes about the character of the man Denys Reitz. It reads as follows. So he's now a cabinet minister, and he writes as follows. At Pretoria, our administrative capital, I attended to official business, and for the next few weeks I was in bondage. Then I broke loose to the far west, to the lower reaches of the Orange River. And I just love this description. This great stream rises in Basotho and runs thence across the breadth of South Africa to empty itself into the Atlantic, 800 miles away. It drains the entire Free State and much of the Transvaal in the Cape Provinces, so that in the summer nearly half the waters of the Union roll between its banks. On the islands towards the coast are European settlements, and there was something like civil war among the irrigators, owing to quarrels in respect of the distribution of water in the canals and furrows. I found them nursing shotguns and rifles across their knees as they fiercely eyed each other from opposite sides of the sluice gates, and it cost me long days of difficult negotiation before the factions came to some kind of agreement. From Kakamas we travelled slowly down the left bank of the river, and so came to the Ograbi's Falls. These are little known on account of the remote desert country in which they lie, but they are among the highest in the world. Close to the edge of the falls, the river narrows down to a granite portal, not more than 15 yards wide, and through this restricted gateway, the accumulated waters of half a continent plunge down 500 feet sheer into a mighty gorge, not unlike that below the Victoria Falls at Livingstone. A lonely farmer lives in the vicinity, and one of his sons guided us to a point from which we could not only watch the immense column leaping over the rim, but see the foaming cauldron far below. The young fellow had grown up beside the river, and he said that he knew a way to the bottom of the gorge. The rest of my party hung back, and they were sound judges, for it was a fearsome descent. We had to go by a crevice in the face of the cliff, and we slowly made our way, testing each foothold before trying the next, until at last we got to a spot where a jutting ledge gave us a standing room just above the heaving cataract. We were now some 400 yards below the falls, and looking up the gorge we could see the water coming over with a roar of thunder, and there stood a cloud of mist and spray. From the falls the torrent came racing down towards us in an angry flood, throwing up great waves and eddying wildly. But I watched the driftwood, and I noticed that some of the logs slowed down at a certain point, and even started to float upstream again. From this I concluded that the water, probably due to submerged rocks, was taking a rotary movement, and that for all its frightening aspect, the gorge was not as dangerous as it seemed. And I decided to make a test. I stripped and dived in, and it was as I thought, for there was something of an upstream current, and I was able to make headway. I was tossed and buffeted a good deal, and at times there was a sensation of remoteness from the outside world, for on either side the walls of the mighty canyon stood so high that but a strip of blue sky showed, making one feel a mere speck in the waste of waters. I am a good swimmer, and I covered the 400 yards by dint of battling, and I was even able to get into a vast cavern behind the fall. The water came over with such force that it set up a downward current of air like a giant ventilator in a mine shaft. It was a vivid experience. After cruising around in the backwater at the rear of the falls, I returned the way I had come and rejoined my guide, who had been watching my escapade with some alarm. We now climbed up the cliff, and after another terrible scramble, we reached the top in safety. At the Boer homestead, the old farmer held up his hands on being told what I had done. But when I asked him whether the gorge had been swum before, he said bluntly that no one had ever been such a damn fool as to try. All the same, my record stands. I conclude by saying something about the relationship between Denys Reitz and Jan Smuts, which lasted for the whole of Denys's adult life. Although Denys would have been aware of Smuts, who was the Attorney General of the Transvaal Republic, at the same time as Denys's father, F.W. Reitz, was the Transvaal State Secretary, and by the way, it was Denys's father who penned the ultimatum to Great Britain, which gave rise to the Boer War. And although their paths had crossed a few times during the early stages of the Boer War, it was during the incursion of the Smuts Commando into the Cape Colony that their relationship developed. Before then, at a time when he was in the Magaliesberg near Johannesburg on his own, Denys had read in a newspaper he came across in an unoccupied farmhouse that a group of Boer guerrillas were marauding in the Cape Colony, and he immediately decided, there and then, to head for the colony. After many adventures, he succeeded in doing just that, with the dwindling band of companions he had managed to persuade to join him in his colonial venture. But it was entirely by chance that they came upon the Smuts Commando of about 300 men, close to the border between the Orange Free State Republic and the Cape Colony, with the same objective in mind. The two groups joined forces, and what followed was one of the most fascinating and challenging sagas of the war. At one stage when they were in the colony, Commando came across a pineapple-like fruit at a time when they were being hounded by the English forces and had as a result been unable to obtain food from the local farmers, which had become their colonial habit. So a number of them ate this fruit, which seemed tasty enough, but very soon all who had eaten it became seriously sick, to the point of being almost comatose. In the book he gives the scientific name of the fruit that they ate, but I can't remember it. Smuts was one of the worst of the sufferers, but luckily Denys had not touched the fruit at all. While they were retreating from pursuing British forces up a mountainside, Denys noticed that the almost helpless Smuts and the group of men who were assisting them had lagged behind, and that they were in critical danger of being shot or captured. Denys tied his two horses to a tree, dashed down the mountainside on foot to warn Smuts and his helpers, and guided them in a different direction, out of the line of fire of the English soldiers. In so doing, Denys almost certainly saved the life of Smuts, and a day or two later Smuts came and thanked Denys for his bravery and his assistance. Later, when the Commando more or less had the run of the Northern Cape, Smuts appointed Reitz to his staff, and Reitz seemed to be continually traversing long distances, delivering messages to outlying guerrilla forces and reporting back to Smuts. When Smuts was invited to the peace conference at Vereniging, he was able to take two men with him, and obviously they went under the truce of that they were permitted to go without any problems. He chose to take his brother-in-law, Krieger, and Denys Reitz, whose father he correctly anticipated would be at the peace conference. Thus, there were considerable dealings between Smuts and Reitz during the latter part of the war. A year or two later, when Denys was struggling to survive in voluntary exile in Madagascar, he received a letter from Smuts' wife, in which she said that her husband, together with Botha, Herzog, and other Boer leaders, were at work rebuilding their countries from the ruins of war, and that if South Africa under British rule was good enough for them, it was good enough for him. Stricken with malaria, this letter turned Denys' thoughts strongly homeward, and after a challenging journey home with a high malarial fever, he managed to make his way back to Pretoria. He describes this in his second book, Trekking On, as follows, quote, "I reached Pretoria at sunrise with a fresh bout of fever upon me, which left me so weak that I only had strength to crawl to the Burger Park, where I lay in a stupor for some hours. Later on, I found myself back on the platform of the railway station with a knot of people gathered around me. Then a man recognized me. He must have set to work at once, for soon a Kate cart drove up, into which I was lifted, and I woke to find myself in bed in the home of my former chief, General Smuts. What to me is remarkable about this episode is that contained in his knapsack was the original Dutch manuscript from which Commando was subsequently written and published in 1929 in English. How fortunate we are that it did not get lost along the way, as might so easily have happened. In No Outspan, Denys says, and I quote, "For the next 3 years, he and Mrs. Smuts kept me in their own home, and for their help and understanding in those dark days, I have not sufficient words of gratitude." He says the following in Trekking On, "For nearly 3 years, General Smuts and his wife kept me by them, nursing me back to health of mind and body. During that time, I slowly shook free of malaria and entered an office to study law. Our family seemed in a bad way. My father lay ill far off in America, and his wife and 7 small children were in straitened circumstances. My eldest brother, Hjalmar, having returned from his prison, was now in Holland, struggling in poverty to complete his studies, and my brother Jabir was on a fever-stricken plantation on the west coast of Madagascar. My younger brother Arend had, after many vicissitudes, reached Table Bay, where he was working as a dockhand. Thus, in common with many thousands of others, we experienced the aftermath of war." Also in Trekking On, Denys records that, and I quote, "In 1908, I convinced General Smuts that I could at last fend for myself again. So I said goodbye to him and to his wife, the 2 people to whom I owe most in the world, and with a few law books and the political idealisms which he and General Botha had taught me for my chief possessions, I set out to earn a living." And he went to Heilbronn, where he practiced as an attorney. It is hardly surprising then that Denys Reitz was a follower of Smuts for the rest of his life. This had nothing to do with politics. Although Louis Botha used to visit Smuts on his farm at Irene, Denys listening to them planning the political future of South Africa, and he was clearly influenced by them. But in my opinion, the loyalty between Reitz and Smuts, and it was reciprocal, owed everything to the struggles they had endured together on Commando during the Boer War. Shared hardships, such as they had endured together under the most trying of circumstances, produced a loyalty that was unshakable, and certainly the relationship of trust between Smuts and Reitz over a period of some 40 years bears eloquent testimony to this. The loyalties forged by wartime comradeship are also illustrated by the fact that decades after the Boer War, Denys received a letter from General Christian de Wet requesting Denys to visit him on his Free State farm. Denys was then a cabinet minister in the Smuts government. De Wet was a nationalist, and they had opposed one another during the 1914 rebellion, during which de Wet had been captured, arrested and convicted of treason, but sent home to his farm on parole. Denys immediately went to visit de Wet on his farm, not long after diving into the Agrabis Falls, and he writes of this subsequent sad encounter as follows, and I quote, "I was shocked at his appearance. Instead of the square, virile figure I had known, there stood before me a haggard, shrunken man. His beard was ungroomed, his laces dragged on the ground, and his clothes hung loosely on an emaciated body. His hands were swollen with some disease, and he tottered in his gait as he came to greet me. I placed him in a chair and asked why he had summoned me, but he was unable to say. He sat with his hands pressed against his forehead, trying vainly to remember, and I had to go off with the question unsolved. I like to think that knowing his end to be near, in his darkened mind had come the wish to say a last word of remembrance and friendship before he trod the common road. He died shortly after, and we decreed him a state funeral. He is buried at the foot of the National Monument at Bloemfontein." End of quote. Thus, fierce loyalties were forged during the Tweede Vryheidsoorlog, and there is no finer account of hardship, loyalty, love of horses, commando campfires, and comradeship than is to be found in Commando. In his own way, Denys Reitz was, and thanks to his books, remains primus inter pares. And in both Adrift on the Open Veld and Die Sterre Gelei, we are privileged to have brilliant accounts of the action-packed lifetime of this South African par excellence. I conclude with another, you'll be happy to hear, with another extract from Little Gidding by T.S. Eliot, which in my opinion encapsulates something of the spirit of Denys Reitz. We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. In a way, this mirrors my experience of reading Denys Reitz. Each time I return to his books, I experience an enhanced understanding of some aspect of my own beloved country, South Africa. Thank you for your attention.